you are probably starting to think about the kinds of gifts that you want to get for various loved ones, especially if you live in the US and especially if you celebrate Christmas. And as a watcher of this channel, you might be thinking, what books should you buy for your various loved ones for this holiday season? I have a fair number of suggestions for you. Fitting in with the theme of this channel, there's a lot of like classic books. I think every book that I'm recommending is very good. Many of them are great, but I've also tried to break them up into some themes that could maybe help you narrow in on one or two. That means I'm going to talk about things like books for dads or books for moms. But of course, keep in mind that you don't have to get the dad book for your dad or the mom book for your mom. Good books are typically quite universal. And so we should just give great books to people. That's enough of a preamble. So let's just dive right into this little list. I'm not just thinking about books that I would get for my dad. I actually would say I have a pretty bad track record with getting my dad books. I've bought him a lot of books for Christmas over the years, and I think he's read a few of them. I don't know if he's loved any of them. I once got him a book that I thought would be really great, and he thought I was like sending him a secret message that I actually hated him or something. And I had to explain to him that no, I just thought it was a good book, but you know, still, I'm thinking now not just about my own dad, but about kind of the archetypal dad. So I wanted books that explore the theme of fatherhood, and two very different picks came to mind when I thought about that. One of them is The Odyssey. Obviously, The Odyssey is a classic. It any list of the Western canon, The Odyssey is going to make the list. And it's also just great poetry, and it's an epic story. All of these are really great things. But from the very beginning of the story, one of the major themes is the relationship and between Telemachus and Odysseus. And much of the inciting incident is actually Telemachus going to find his father, wanting to seek out his father because their estate is increasingly in ruins, and Penelope is having to defend it from various suitors, essentially using various methods of deceit. So not only is The Odyssey just a truly great book, and it's one that basically every single person should read, but also if you got it for your dad, I think he would immediately resonate with that story between a father and son. So I wouldn't say you only have to get it for your dad if you're a guy. The second book for your dad is a bit of a downer, and so you might want to warn him. And that's The Road by Cormac McCarthy. The Road is a gruesome book. It is terrific, but it's sad. It hurts. This is one of those books where I felt genuinely empty inside after I read it. But one of the reasons that it is so powerful, one of the reasons it can make you feel so awful, is that it depicts a father's love in a desperate situation. Maybe not every person wants to read a book like this, and maybe this isn't the right book for your dad. But I do think as an illustration of fatherly love, it's quite moving. And Cormac McCarthy is one of the great living writers. So, introducing someone to Cormac McCarthy's work is, I think, already a service. Plus, I think The Road just deserves to be read quite widely. If your dad doesn't like books, you can also get the movie. I've heard the adaptation is very good, though I personally have not watched it. And that's not for any particular reason. That's just because I just don't watch that many films anymore. But the third book I'd recommend for dads is not actually a book about fatherhood. It's the beginning of a trilogy, but it's actually a presidential biography. I have no evidence for this generalization, but many older men that I know like presidential biographies. They love biographies of people from American history. Um, I know a lot of older men in the United States. So that's what I'm basing the generalization on. Um, and of those biographies, actually, the United States is pretty blessed by having some truly great writers writing very good presidential biographies. What I'm going to recommend that you get for your dad is Edmund Morris's biography of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is just like this genuinely fascinating character. Morris wrote a 3-volume series. The first volume is called The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, and that would be the one that I suggest that you start with. Obviously, reading a kind of big, especially a 3-part series of presidential biography is going to be for a certain type of reader and a certain type of person. So obviously keep that in mind if you're thinking about buying this. But I would just say, Morris is writing a great biography. Next up are books for moms. For these books, I wanted to think about books that could explore the themes of motherhood, just like we had books for dad that explored the themes of fatherhood. And I just wanted to think about ones that really deeply explored human relationships. And I want to start off actually with a contemporary recommendation, and that is My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. Um, Ferrante is a highly acclaimed modern writer. She has written a number of books, but the books that began with My Brilliant Friend, it's a quartet. They are widely loved and widely read, and her ability to tell a compelling story about what really is a fairly small slice of life for her growing up in post-war Italy. It's very touching. It's very moving. It's gripping in a way that you really wouldn't expect with a story like this. I think it just shows that Ferrante is kind of a master of the craft. Obviously, if you want to go a little bit above and beyond, you can get more than the first book in that series. I have only read My Brilliant Friend. I haven't read the others. But my wife, for instance, has read all of them and she loved them. She just devoured them. Really, my recommendation here is kind of inspired by just the sheer love that I saw for those books from her. The next book is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Alcott is this is a classic. This is a just great work of American writing. It has also been adapted a number of times. I have only seen the more recent adaptation of Little Women, um, and I thought it was astounding too. I really kind of like the idea of maybe these bundles of gifts where you give someone a book and you give them a DVD of the adaptation. I don't know, do people still give DVDs, but if you had some way to also maybe like watch the film with them, um, because people like seeing books adapted, and people really love complaining about bad adaptations or talking about how it was great that that adaptation didn't ruin the book or something like that. And Little Women has been adapted a number of times, so you get lots of opportunities to do that. It's also just a very good story. Each of the sisters has their own kind of personality. They aren't flat, they're dynamic, they are rich characters, and you get to go through years and years with them. I have another recommendation here, but it was suggested by my co host on the podcast, Wesley, and it's a book that I haven't read. So I'm just going to say that Wesley wanted me to add this on here, and that was Middlemarch by George Eliot. George Eliot obviously is a pseudonym for Mary Ann Evans. I realize now that in this list, all of the books that I recommended for moms were written by women, and all of the books that I recommended for dads were written by men. That wasn't intentional. I think that just kind of happened organically. And I want to say, men can read books by women and women can read books by men, obviously. And so, once again, don't adhere too strongly to these categories in your recommendations. Um, I'm trying to guide you to what I think can be some great books to give as gifts. But so much of giving a gift is about knowing um, who the person is and what they will truly love and enjoy. All right, next up is I want to talk about books for high school students. Maybe you got that teenager in your life. You want to get them a book, but you're really not sure where to start. Obviously there's a lot of stuff that's like YA out there. And I'm not going to say anything positive or negative about it in this video. I'm just going to say that we shouldn't just restrict even middle schoolers or especially high schoolers to that kind of writing. They are not too young to be reading the classics, and you can find classic books, high quality works of literature that will speak to them, and we should want to push them, right. Unlike my books for parents, I'm not making any assumptions about the sex of the person that you're giving the gift to. These are books just roughly for someone between 14 and 18, and they're books that I mostly read when I was between 14 and 18, that had an impact on me. First is J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. It is hard to overstate how much I loved that book when I first read it. It is also hard for me to overstate how let down I felt when I tried to read it years later. I've never tried to read it a third time, but I just felt like The Catcher in the Rye was really the book I needed to read at a very particular time in my life. High school is probably that time for a lot of people. So if you want them to read The Catcher in the Rye, go ahead and get it to them now. And let's see. This is great for students who are striving for authenticity, wondering about their own identity in the world, wondering how they're going to find meaning in their lives. Once again, grab The Catcher in the Rye. The next book is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Great story of a great coming of age story, even though Scout is actually pretty young here, but we get to see her sort of mature and learn about the world. Great story set in the American South in a way that has uh, kind of a brutal depiction of some of the horrors of that world, and also shows some of its charms, and shows a virtuous figure like Atticus Finch, who I think is really great to hold up as like an exemplar for our students. So you see themes of justice, of fairness, of inclusion, of age, both as the very young scout, but also various people who are clearly getting older in the book and sort of their struggles here. We see concerns about race and class. Uh, Really, I think just a great book for all of them to read. That might still just be just like a required reading book, and maybe find out for your high schooler if this is required reading. Don't just get them something they had to read in school. But if it's not required for them, get it to them, and then try to encourage them to really dive in. And I think any high schooler could probably get a lot out of it. If you have a high schooler who just really loves to read and really loves classics already, buy them a nice copy of Shakespeare's collected works. As with all of the recommendations, I have a link down in the show notes. Those are affiliate links, so I make a little bit of money if you buy it from there. But I'm also doing that so you can find the editions that I would recommend for these sorts of gifts. Shakespeare obviously is a titan of English language literature, and for that reason alone, he should be on a list of gift giving probably. Uh, but Shakespeare is very readable for many modern readers, and I think buying a big collection will just allow someone to have like those lovely quiet days of flipping through a big book, wondering about what they want to read, stumbling upon something new. If they're not maybe super into theater or poetry, maybe they are into, but you think they would still like to read something. Get them a nice hardback set of The Lord of the Rings. What a great gift! What great books! I mean, I've talked multiple times about how much I love The Lord of the Rings, so you don't need to hear me say it. But handing someone a high quality copy of those books could encourage them to really spend some time with those texts. Uh, and I know a lot of people who did not consider themselves big readers, and The Lord of the Rings sort of changed that for them. And it was sort of a gateway into just a life of reading. And finally, a good solid recommendation for just about any high school student who already likes to read is Emily Dickinson's poetry. I talk about Emily Dickinson every once in a while on this channel, usually offhandedly. I've never done a full episode on her, but she is one of the greats of American poetry. And I think you can get a collection of her work, like basically all of Emily Dickinson's poetry, for what, $20. And that's a nice high quality gift. It can be thoughtful if given to the right person, and it's just, and you are introducing someone to a world of beauty, truth, and goodness as expressed through the kind of painful words sometimes of Emily Dickinson. Maybe the student, though, that you have in mind is a little more artsy. Maybe they're into theater or something like this, and they want to go a little bit deeper than someone like Shakespeare. The recommendations for those kinds of students, I would recommend three different books. One of them is a collection of Samuel Beckett's plays. Beckett obviously is dealing with absurdism. I feel like high school is a really good time to try to get into absurdism, at least to learn a little bit about it. Waiting for Godot is just this wonderful work of modern literature, and modern theater, I should say. But actually, for instance, Beckett's play, known as Play, is also really quite good. He's such a kind of gripping and strange playwright that the right kind of reader will really be inspired by that. You can also find great recordings and performances of some of Beckett's plays, and that might be something to sort of suggest to anyone that you got for these books. Another one, if you have like a really artsy kid around, there's this book by Bringhurst called The Elements of Typographic Style, and it is about how to like typeset and how to handle typography and page design. And for certain kinds of students, they will eat this up. I think this is like a masterpiece of a book. It's beautiful to hold, and you just learn so much. Obviously, because this author has thought about not only how to make a page beautiful, but how to make a page beautiful such that people love to read it and they want to spend time with a book. It's based on this really wonderful idea that we should make books beautiful enough that people want to spend a lot of time with them. And then a little bit of an offbeat recommendation for a poet would be the poetry of H.D. H.D. Hilda Doolittle was her full name. Was a part of Imagism. It's hard to classify Imagism as a school of poetry. At least one scholar kind of characterized it as just like a couple of people who happen to share a few um, techniques or themes. Ezra Pound, who might actually be my favorite poet, but Ezra Pound is another imagist. But for now, I would say HD's poetry. HD's poetry can be really quite powerful, and just the right sort of student's gonna respond quite well to that. Let's say though that you have a student who is interested in philosophy and you want to get them started on a life of studying that wonderful subject. First of all, I would recommend Plato's Complete Works. You can get a copy of Plato's Complete Works translated by Cooper, and you can get a hardback edition of it for $50. Now, $50 is not a cheap gift, but what an amazing bargain that is for the amount of knowledge and wisdom that you can glean from reading those texts. And you want to get a nice copy for them, because one, it's a gift, but also that way that text is gonna stick around with them for years. My other recommendations, though, would be Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, uh, Albert Camus' The Stranger, and then a new book by Zena Hitz called Lost in Thought. This book is actually about the joys of the intellectual life. Hitz is a living philosopher. She teaches at St. John's, and the book is just really well done. I enjoyed it quite a bit when I read it this year. Hitz is also a lover of the classics. She has a project called the Catherine Project, which has free classes for people to read great books, with hand selected tutors. She's doing great work over there, and I think her book is worth reading. And I think it's written at an accessible enough level that a high school student could read it. What about those book lovers? These are people who don't just like to read, but they like love books. First, I would recommend two books that are actually just about like the joys of reading. One of them is On Reading Well by Karen Swallow Prior. Prior is going to talk about the various virtues, the classical virtues, and then use various literature to illustrate those virtues. Prior does have a religious lens. This is how I encountered her. That said, I think that the book is fairly universal, so that anyone, even if they weren't religious, but was just interested in sort of these classical understanding of the virtues and also classics of literature, they would be able to read those, and read Prior's comments on those, and they would get a lot out of it. Another book, which is just about exploring why reading is such a wonderful thing, something I don't have to convince you about if you're watching this channel, is The Pleasure of Reading in the Age of Distraction by Alan Jacobs. I will not have links to these in the show notes, except to just link you to the whole website. But there is an organization called the Folio Society. They make beautiful editions of classic works of fiction and of nonfiction. If you have someone who just loves books, one great way to give them a book is to not give them a book you think they'd like, but to get a book that you know they love and get them a beautiful copy of it. The Folio Society books are not cheap. I don't own a single one, but I think they're really beautiful. And if someone gave me one as a gift, I would think that was great. And finally, I'm going to recommend my only non-book on the list, but for book lovers. The non-book is to get them an e-reader. A lot of people really like e-readers. I have mixed feelings, though I still use my Kindle quite a bit, and I'm looking at other alternative e-readers too. In fact, that will partially be the subject of a future video. But a Kindle can be incredibly useful. It's really nice for like a college student who's not going to have a lot of room in their dorm, but wants to read a lot of books. I think they're like $99 right now for like the new Kindle Paperwhite model, and that's a pretty good deal. So I'm going to throw a link down to that in the show notes too. Also, those Kindles, they just last forever. I had a Kindle that I got when I was going to college, and it lasted for years and years and years. I replaced it eventually because I destroyed it by dropping it in water. But the new ones are also waterproof, and you could read them in the bath if you wanted, or you could take them to the pool. Um, so these Kindles are, I think, just usually a pretty good bargain. What about books for someone who loves fantasy and science fiction? I know that there are some of you out there who watch this channel as well. Not everyone wants to just read the classics. I'm going to go a little off the beaten path for some of these, and then also choose one that's like a fairly traditional recommendation. First, I would introduce someone to the works of Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler was a 20th century Octavia Butler was a 20th century writer. I believe she lived into the 21st century before passing away. There are two series of hers that I would especially recommend. One of them is this like parable series. I don't know if that's the full name of the series, but it's Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower. That's a great pair of books. Tells a complete story, written as journals, which is an interesting stylistic choice. Not one that I typically love. I think Butler does it pretty well. Another are the books that often get called the Lilith Brood trilogy, and that begins with Dawn. Octavia Butler, great writer. Um, If I ever did a video on Ursula K. Le Guin, a writer you all know that I love, I would also mention Octavia Butler. In fact, I think at one point I had a script for a video that was like the queens of science fiction, and it was going to be Butler and Le Guin. And since you already know that I love Le Guin so much, I don't have to recommend her, though her books also are always very good. Next is that for maybe that more mathematically or scientifically inclined reader is Neil Stephenson's work. I have talked about how much I liked Anathem or Anathem. I never know how to say that one. But I recently read Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson, and I think that was a really good one too. I have some quibbles with the execution of that book. I think that there are some weird choices, but it's obviously really, really interesting, especially if you're at all interested in the science of living in space or space exploration. And then also my final recommendation for the science fiction and fantasy lover is to get the trilogy, the original Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. You can get it as a single hardback, and you can get a really nice edition. I found what I think is the nicest looking edition that's still pretty affordable, like under $50, which I think would make a really nice gift for someone. This is a classic of science fiction. There's a chance that the person who you're buying a gift for might have already read it, but it's such a nice edition that it still is a very thoughtful gift. Next, I want to talk about books for kids, maybe around middle school or so, who don't like to read. So one of the difficulties with recommending books for this demographic is that there's so much stuff competing for their attention. We have to deal with like Minecraft or TV or YouTube. I mean, there's just a war on for the eyeballs of kids, right? And so many kids don't develop a love of reading at a young age because of this. And you might be thinking, can I get them a book that's going to help them start to love reading? I don't have a ton of specific recommendations for this demographic, in part due to a lack of experience. But I want to mention two possibilities. One is I know from personal experience by talking to people who are parents, if you have a kid who like loves Minecraft, they have like Minecraft like graphic novels, and you'll see kids who don't like to read, they'll devour those things. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of graphic novels, to be honest, but anything that gets a kid into the habit of reading is a good thing in my mind. So if you've got a kid like that, find what already interests them and then find them a book. Minecraft here is really just an example. Another one that I think could be interesting for the right age would be something like the Percy Jackson books, because they're so steeped in classical mythology. You might even pair them with a classic book like Bullfinch's mythology. Bullfinch's mythology is not easy for kids to read. It's almost like an encyclopedia of mythology. But I had this idea that if you got the kids the Percy Jackson books, got them hooked on this story, this very modern story with lots of references to classical mythology, and then you introduced them and then you gave them Bullfinches, one day they're just going to start flipping through Bullfinch and they're going to discover a whole new world of literature. Finally, what about books for adults who don't like to read? My advice here is don't buy them a book. I have tried to get books for people who don't like to read before, and it's not that I have suddenly changed their lives. It is almost always that I've just gotten them a bad gift. While it is always a noble thing to try to get someone to start to love reading, we have to recognize that when we're buying gifts for people, we are actually trying to show that we know them well and that we love them. And crucial to loving someone is loving them for who they are, not just who they could be. And so don't buy a book that is purely aspirational because you would love it if your friend was the type of person who read that book. Buy them something they'll love, and maybe then also recommend that they go and read a good book. All right, that's all I have for today. If you have other books that you think would be great gifts, put them in the comments. I would love to see a discussion about this stuff. These are just my ideas. I'm no expert in buying gifts, but I think maybe together we could come up with a really terrific list. Take care.